Well, I always have so much fun talking to you. It's nice to have an excuse to talk to you.
Yeah, yeah,
Sometimes sometimes doing stuff in public is like a good forcing function.
yeah,
Tell people who you are, though. You are a WebRTC community stalwart,
yeah, yeah,
amazing programmer. You've written a bunch of code that many, many, many people use, including everybody who uses OpenAI stuff. Tell people who you are.
yeah, yeah. So the I got my start doing like WebRTC, like doing telephony stuff, like asterisk and stuff like that, and then I I found WebRTC. Like I wanted to build more server stuff, and so I did Pion, the Go implementation of WebRTC. Like I wanted it to be more flexible and like do work in these weird ways. And then I bounced between WebRTC companies. So I did like a C embedded stuff for AWS, and then did WebRTC FaceTime and like Twitch and broadcasting stuff. And now I work at OpenAI doing like the real-time API. So I did that stuff, and then that also like powers the 1-800 ChatGPT and the embedded. So like bumping around all in these like different projects that do WebRTC. I love it.
Should we do a quick like lay of the land for WebSockets, WebRTC, SIP, which is really important to a
Yeah,
lot of AI use cases because it's kind of the underlying telephony glue layer. I tell people a lot that WebRTC is good for some stuff, WebSockets is good for some stuff. You need to understand a little bit about SIP. I think both of us don't like giving people advice. We like
yeah,
just sort of trying to lay out some technical definitions. So WebRTC, like you got started in WebRTC kind of early. What drew you to WebRTC?
yeah. So I worked at a company, well, at Etsy, and we were paying for all of these video products, and like tens of thousands of dollars to be able to make a conference call to someone else on your computer. And when WebRTC came out, it just seemed absolutely magical that for like very low code, you could just connect two things. And so I wrote this little bot that would send offer answers over IRC, and I was like, oh, this is magical. Like that was the moment I kind of fell in love with it. Like I had done like RTP and all that stuff for years, and so I felt comfortable with it. But that was like the moment that I'm like, dang, like it's in the browser, no plugins, and it just works. I think that like from then on, I was hooked.
So WebRTC is a protocol built into browsers and accessible on every platform
Yep.
now that's designed from the ground up for exactly what you and I are doing, very low latency audio and video communication. OpenAI shipped an API, as a lot of people do initially, for real-time voice AI that was only WebSocket. And now you're adding WebRTC, or you actually already did add
Yep.
WebRTC. What's the trajectory there? Like, how do you think about the engineering trajectory
Yeah.
there?
Yeah. So for me, WebRTC is exciting for two reasons. Like one is the one that's immediately obvious to me is how easy it is to use. Like you don't need to know anything about audio sample rates or encoders or bandwidth estimation. It's just like you generate this offer, you generate this answer, and then you go and run with it. And I think that's like the first part that's most exciting. I'm sure you see with like your customers is like the fact that people who aren't technical, they can go and build like really really cool things, and that's the first part that I love about WebRTC.
It's a little bit complicated to explain to people, though. At least
Yeah,
it is for me, which is if you're a programmer and you've written a bunch of stuff, you've almost certainly used WebSockets. So if you're thinking about trying to like have a long-lived bidirectional communication channel between a server and an app, you're probably just going to reach for WebSockets by default. And the WebSockets API is pretty simple and pretty accessible and certainly familiar and widely supported. But if you reach for WebSockets initially, you're going to end up sort of building all of these pieces yourself, like echo cancellation, the codec management, bitrate stuff, and you're actually not going to have enough knobs you can turn that you're going to be able to build something that is robust in production for a really wide variety of real world users and network conditions. WebRTC, on the other hand, is a little more complicated to wrap your head around. There's more moving parts. The APIs aren't as simple, although you've done an amazing job with the very clean API in the new OpenAI stuff, so we can come back to that. But in general, if I point people at WebRTC, it's a little bit overwhelming. On the other hand, all those things that you will struggle to build yourself are all there, as you were just saying. So what I generally tell people is if you're just hacking, building something for yourself, or doing a server to server use case, WebSockets are fine. But if you actually want to build something that connects a browser or a mobile app over the internet with all the unpredictability of like end user internet connections, you should definitely like invest the time to figure out what WebRTC stuff is available and use WebRTC, because otherwise you will have a long, slow, painful process of eventually figuring out you have to move to
Yeah.
WebRTC.
Yeah. I feel bad because it's, people build these really cool things and then comes the day of like, oh, I want to do multiple video tracks, but like, oh, your WebSocket protocol just has a concept of video buffers and now I have to split them up. And oh, you want to go multilingual, oh, you want to add and remove tracks and all these things and all. And it's like the complexity of WebRTC, you're like, it starts to make sense. And that's kind of why I wrote WebRTC for the Curious, because I feel like a lot of people, they get into WebRTC and they have so much frustration because they're like, oh, the system, it's frustrating, I don't want to use it. And then as you go through it, you start to appreciate the frustrating parts of it. I feel like WebRTC is the great compromise where everyone got what they wanted so they could build, because people use WebRTC for like VPNs and people use it for security cameras and people use it for broadcasting, and everyone's unhappy with it because it's like it does too much and so it annoys them. But the thing that is too much is another is that other company that makes billions of dollars depends on. So I I personally don't think I could design a better protocol than WebRTC just because it's been informed by years of experience. And like for a lot of people, they look at the complexity of WebRTC and they're like, oh, people in the committees that sat down in 2010, they made these terrible APIs. The thing is WebRTC is like built on these things that are actually from like the 2000s and the 90s, and like we're talking like 30 years of like this 40 years of design and deliberation and like all these problems that people have anticipated. I find it hard to believe that like I know I personally can't sit down and like bang out a WebSocket thing that can compete with like all of those like trade-offs and things that people have thought about.
Yeah. Do you want 20 millisecond open
Yeah.
frame time, or do you want 40 millisecond open frame time? All that kind of stuff.
I mean, it just goes on, and it's like, oh, like you gotta like do H.264 profiles, and oh, we didn't talk about like which extension headers you're gonna need to express like video orientation. Like it never ends.
It
So that's why
never.
yeah, that's why I
I,
love being in the sandbox.
I love the low level networking and codec stuff. It makes me happy, which is good because we started a startup 8, 9 something years ago now to play with this stuff, and we're still doing the same thing. So you have to really like it to do it for that long. But it's definitely, I mean, our whole value prop is we try to wrap even the complexity of the WebRTC APIs and all those knobs you can turn when you're trying to build on top of all those pieces that WebRTC gives you, and make them really accessible to as wide a variety of developers as possible. I also really love the infrastructure stuff. I mean, sort of building out a global distributed system that's really, really good at routing audio video packets, that has its, even separate from the codec stuff, that has its own really interesting deep rabbit holes of optimization. I think you did a really nice job, but I'm coming around, but I'm still a little skeptical about the design of the new WebRTC stuff for the OpenAI API. And that builds on some really newer extensions to the WebRTC kind of protocol stack. Do you want to talk about like
Yeah.
WIF and how you were thinking
Yeah.
about that?
So WebRTC, before it said, you have these blobs of information, this offer answer, and we don't care how you get it to each other. Like, imagine if I have a WebRTC session and you have one, uh, WebRTC says like you can do it via WebSocket, you can do it via protobufs, you can do it via AVN over IP. Like we don't care. Like as long as we
Carrier
get those,
pigeon.
yeah, it's fine. It's like and but there's this new standard called WIP that says that this exchange of offer answer must happen over HTTP, and it must happen like in this very particular URL format, and you must send this HTTP authorization header, and it must be a bearer token. So it really like ratcheted it down and said like, and this was important because for tools like FFmpeg and OBS, that you can't write any code in there, so it has to be just a URL and an input field, and that's where that all came into play. And there was two things I saw there. Is I believe that people will use these tools to go into the real-time API because they'll want, to send like broadcast tools and security cameras and all these things that you can't write any code on. The other thing that that was informed by was the embedded side. So I had done an embedded project with a uh, another WebRTC server, and it required two peer connections and a WebSocket, and it was like incredibly resource intensive on the microcontroller. And so when doing this, I wanted to keep it as simple as possible with the hope of like bringing on all these super light clients because if we had smart doorbells and all these things and they could only be $25 and I can send audio and I can connect them to the real-time API, I think that would be really magical. So that's what it was informed by, like this too of like I see tools and I want to keep it as lightweight as possible. Oh, another thing that really excites me is that not having to use an SDK. So like my experience with doing Pion is that people want to do WebRTC from weird places, and so like I love the fact that like people are using the real-time API from like Elixir and they're using it from GStreamer and they're going to use it from all these weird places. And if like I'm like, hey, you got to download my JS SDK that's got 500 lines of my proprietary stuff, you got to port that to all those different platforms. But like if we keep the API as like brutally simple as possible, then it lets people do more interesting things. And I always keep saying one more. So the last one is I'm really excited about like vendor interoperability, where um, you have like someone that's like you have some vendors that are really good at one thing. So like you could send um, like video into Daily, and then Daily could then send it to somewhere else. Kind of
Yep.
kind of like this the same ethos of Pipecat. That like the idea is like everyone is good at one thing, and if we have these kind of simple standardized protocols, that it's better for builders, developers, users because they can just send off instead of like being captured in the ecosystem of one provider, they can like send WebRTC out and pull it in because they just send it to the person that does best. So I'm sure you have like a million thoughts because I just blabbed and blabbed and blabbed. But so yeah,
No, I think all of that is really well put, and I agree with all of it, and it's exciting. In particular, the vendor interop stuff has been a big missing piece since the very beginning of WebRTC, and that is true for a good reason, which is that the signaling layer protocol was kind of the one piece that there was kind of no way to make it work for every possible use case. And so signaling was unspecified in the WebRTC standard, and that basically meant that everybody had to invent signaling from the ground up, and there was no way to have real interop between any WebRTC platforms or tools. And this approach goes a very long way to fixing that. I'm also super excited about the embedded stuff, which we'll come back to in a second,
yeah,
because I really like little hardware. But I will say that the one concern I have comes from supporting people doing kind of video communication and audio communication use cases for so long and trying to build good developer tools. And SDKs have felt really important to me to wrap the complexity. So things like, what do you do when your RTP connection drops? If you push that onto the application programmer, there's a pretty good chance they'll struggle to figure out what the right approach is. And there's 100 of those things. And the only way I kind of can wrap my head around like building some abstractions around all of those things that are tricky once you have something out there that people are using to build real applications is to build a pretty big SDK. But there are big drawbacks to having a big SDK, including like you can't run it on like these little things, which now that you've got your C code for embedded stuff published, I really want to make this little robot uh, fully WebRTC capable.
uh, yeah. It's I think that's also a reflection of the difference in how we approach problems. Like I think that you spend a lot of time and you work with these businesses that they don't care about the details of WebRTC, not in a, like not in a demeaning way, but in a they want to go build there's this really cool product and they don't have time to sweat the details. Um, and so yeah, you deeply understand like building these SDKs and doing all these things. But if you look at how I've always talked with people, like even with WebRTC Curious and like Pion, when people say abstract away the details, I say like, oh no, the beauties of the details. Let me show you. Let me show you. So that's, I think that's like an inherent problem to how I think about things. It has its pros and its cons that like I I I have such a hard time. I don't want to abstract things away from people because I believe like that everyone's smart and they can figure it out, and like I want to give you the tools, but then I kind of have a hard time empathizing with the people that are like, please just give me an SDK because I want to do it. So I think other people will build really really good SDKs and abstract it away from in ways that make sense. Like I think like you have a much better grasp at designing these SDKs and thinking about these problems than I do. It's just it has been a chronic problem with how I like design things for years at this point.
Oh no, I mean I think it's
Yeah,
a great strength. The ecosystem around Pion is amazing because you've taken this approach where the granularity of the building blocks really makes sense to people who want to build stuff not from scratch, but whatever
yeah,
the right whatever the right
yeah,
terminology is. Those Pion implementation elements are so clean and they don't hide too much detail, and it's really nice to read that code which you're responsible for, both because you wrote a lot of it and because you created this community that has such a really healthy dynamic around it. Um, I do think. Oh, and everybody should go read WebRTC for the Curious. We'll like figure out how to put the link wherever we post this.
yeah,
Um, it is funny that our experience is that some of our worst customers, in the sense that they struggle, they take up a lot of support time and they struggle to scale, are engineering teams that decide they want to really turn all the knobs.
yeah,
Um, because there's this curve where like you get something working and then you're like, oh, I don't like 720p video. I want my video to be 1080p. And we now have like lots of help documents that are like, well, here's the drawback. Like you can do 1080p, you can do 4K, but here's what's going to happen. And but a certain kind of engineer will read everything we send them and then they will totally not believe it. And so they'll configure for 4K video for end users on mobile devices. And you're like, we told you that just
yeah,
it's going to work for you. It's going to work for you on your iPhone Pro on your fiber connection. Not going to work for any of your users where any is like more than 60%, right? And when 40% of your users are having issues, like you can't scale. So it is funny the different tensions from the different perspectives of who we're targeting.
yeah. I love those users though. Like I love the people that come in with like the weird things. That's why any business, if anyone's ever going to, don't invest in anything I do, because like I will like just overemphasize on the long tail that won't make any money, because I like people that are like into the weird stuff and the details, because that's that's what gets me excited.
Yeah, it's super
Yeah,
fun. A
yeah.
hundred percent.
But then to go back to, you mentioned like I'm super happy with the Pion primitives, but there are multiple servers built on top of Pion, which I think like demonstrated the
Yeah.
fact that it it doesn't, it's like not good enough for like definitely a whole group of users. But I actually love that because the people that I really like talking to are the people building the servers. Like when Julius comes in and like talks about all the details, like I love that. Like I love going back and forth about that. But it actually kind of like, there's another thing I work on, Broadcast Box, where it's like a server for end users, and it kind of makes me sad when people show up and are like, I just want it to work, and then they don't even understand the why. They're like, I want video on the screen, and then they leave once the video on the screen is gone. I'm like, there's like a beauty in like building something together that's lost when like it's just, I don't know. I
Yeah.
but that's a pointless diatribe, I guess. But
No, no.
that's like what, that's why like I build why the things I build look the way they do.
What's the I think people would be interested in hearing what the motivation for Broadcast Box was.
Yeah. So Broadcast Box is kind of this reference implementation for putting WIP into OBS. And the reason that WebRTC broadcasting is so exciting to me is there's like so many things that for me it feels like broadcasting is stuck 10 years behind because the technology doesn't let us do these things. So with broadcasting, it's prohibitively expensive to run like a broadcasting service, and so you don't see a lot of people attempt to do it. But with WebRTC and simulcast, we can put the encoding on the client side, so that makes it really cheap. um, The other thing you can do is with WebRTC, the latency is like really, really low. And so that means that when you broadcast to an audience, it's way more of an intimate relationship where like you'll have like a small group of friends who are like watching gameplay and talking back and forth instead of like blasting out to 10,000 people and just passively talking to them. Like I think that's a better societal experience. That's what gets me so excited about it. And I also love that WebRTC has end-to-end encryption. So like I want to get ahead of this problem that I anticipate that someday some company out there is going to figure out like, hey, like I'm going to insert ads right into the video stream, so they're completely unblockable. And I want to get ahead of that and have WebRTC and end-to-end encryption. So like um, content creators can like have their keys and they give them to their viewers, and so no one in the middle can modify video. So I think it's really really cool. Like there's even more. Oh, and then like mobility. So like WebRTC is designed so that I can like broadcast on my phone and switch between cell towers. You know, go between Wi-Fi and cellular, and that's really cool to me because if people can do these better IRL streaming experiences, right now it's like really hard. Like people do like backpacks and they have like the failovers and they like send RTMP to a server that then makes sure that disconnect protection, like all that goes away if they just use like a protocol that's like like that's not like doesn't have hard connections. So yeah, I encourage like if people are like, what do you think the future of broadcast will be? That's what I hope it is.
There's a really fun rabbit hole here about the evolution of these protocols, like RTMP, which is still sort of the standard for Twitch and for YouTube Live, is such an old protocol. It started out as Macromedia Flash's video protocol, and then got semi-standardized because Flash like owned the whole interactive web for a brief period before JavaScript. But then Flash got bought by Adobe and kind of subsumed into that big corporate entity, and Macromedia was kind of semi-abandoned. And then Steve Jobs like axed it from Safari, and so there's this orphaned protocol that never was really standardized and nobody owns, so nobody can evolve it. But 20 years later, it's still like built into OBS. It's the default in all these platforms. It works, but as you're saying, there needs to be much, much better stuff now in 2025. WebRTC is part of that. The challenge we see with people who are using WebRTC for broadcast in our customer base is it's actually too low latency. So if you're doing RTMP or you're doing HLS or Dash or whatever for video streaming, super, super hard to get down below, say, 3 seconds of latency, which, if you're doing anything interactive, is way too long. WebRTC, partly because of the standard, but partly just because of the way the implementations are all written, it's very hard to do latency higher than 300 milliseconds. That's a big gap, like 300 milliseconds to 3 seconds. And sometimes what you really want is like 800 milliseconds of latency because you can kind of tune the quality differently with bigger buffers. And if you're doing something interactive, but it's not actually like a real time conversation, that's totally fine. Like 800 milliseconds is great. There's kind of no way to do that. Or maybe I'm wrong. Have you thought much about like how do we how do we like find that middle ground?
Um, at least with OBS, I try to keep them. I think the buffer sizes are 3 seconds, and so a receiver could like aggressively knack for those 3 seconds, and like that server could then buffer for that time. But yeah, like in the browser, there's like no APIs to express that. Yeah, I don't know. Like, and this is kind of the what I think has plagued WebRTC for a long time is that the owners of WebRTC, it is a conferencing protocol for like the people that maintain it make money from it. And so how
You
do you
can
convince
use
them?
names here. Like we're all
Oh,
friends here. You can.
yeah, yeah. So
I
like
mean,
I
the
yeah
context here is that like the wonderful thing and sometimes very frustrating thing is that Google is the main arbiter of what does and doesn't go into the WebRTC spec. And that kind of benevolent funding and control of WebRTC has been absolutely critical. Like I do not think WebRTC would have become a ubiquitous standard without Google. Sometimes you submit PRs or bug reports, and when the Google team doesn't think they're like good enough or interesting enough, they just never get anywhere.
yeah yeah it's I don't know what's better. It's we talk about this with like I see this a lot with open source. Like, is it better to have a corporate benefactor who can maybe speed you along faster, or is it better to go it alone and maybe like you have like something that works better for everyone, but it doesn't. I don't know. Like I see this with like programming languages as well. You see this with like Rust and Zit, and like how you have some that like have like corporate owners, and so they're going along faster, but the community itself isn't as like a happy place to be. This is a very like philosophical question. Yeah, it's funny. Like if as my life is WebRTC and Go. So like in a sense, like I owe Google, Google corporate everything. Like they like if ever the protocol I write and the language I write. So like I really should be getting down and saying thanks. So like yeah, it's amazing what happened because in the fact that Google is willing to spend, $360 million on GIPs, like that is a crazy amount of money. So like all of this, like WebRTC only existed because they went and bought the software and then open sourced it. So it's but yeah, I don't know. That's what it is now.
A lot of people in our small world of like video and network hackers think that the way we get to what's beyond WebRTC, the sort of middle ground, more use cases, more flexibility is QUIC and media over QUIC. I often have this conversation with people who are just digging into like how am I going to build a voice AI thing, and sometimes they've done enough like tinkering and they're like, oh, I'm just going to wait for quick. And I do you know this meme where it's I think it's the Goodwill Hunting meme where there's
Yep.
like people talking back and forth and somebody says something and somebody else like starts to repeat what they're saying and then is like no, like in a year you'll think something completely different. I sort of have that feeling when I talk to people about quick because I'm like, yeah, I love quick and it's obviously the future and it's way better than any other protocol we have right now in theory. But it's going to take us 5 years to get it into production for media, for streaming media.
I remember I was at a conference for WebRTC stuff. I think it was like 2019 or 2020, and I was convinced that WebRTC was dead within the next 6 months because like people were showing me the media over quick, and I was like, oh, this is so good. Like
Okay.
I think because at that same event, I sat and talked to Bernard, Luke Curley, and Peter Thatcher, and the trifecta of them talking about quick. I'm like, oh my goodness, WebRTC is done. So yeah, like I didn't anticipate that I would still be doing WebRTC at this point. Like I thought that there was going to be more more quick stuff. I still don't know how quick is going to fall out. Like I hope my only hope is that media over quick or quick stays as easy to use as WebRTC is. Like the thing that makes me love WebRTC is that I have like people that are in high school that show up and they're like, okay, I could run a little bit JS and get stuff connected. I'm a little scared of like, okay, like start your video encoder and set your profile and like do your bandwidth estimator and all these things. And like, I hope that we don't lose that easy on ramp. That would be my only, but I really don't feel strongly about what protocol it is, or I really hope that people can still build like that the big technical guys get what they want, but the little guy can still do the interesting things.
Well, one of the things that really excites me about the new AI use cases, one of many things, is protocols and standards tend to like get in a groove, and once they find their groove, there's a lot of uh, activation energy required to kind of do something really new on top of them. And the AI, the voice AI, and now the sort of conversational multimodal AI use cases are pretty different from the conferencing use cases that were, as you said, the kind of heart and soul of WebRTC. WebRTC serves them pretty well, but I've been having fun thinking about like what are the building blocks that even in the WebRTC world we could re-architect some of the things we do to be more efficient, more flexible, more hackable, easier for the voice AI use cases. And then when you extend that to thinking about, oh, this could actually be a nice catalyst for a transition to media over quick. I kind of think that in a couple years we may see adoption of quick for these new use cases in a way that we would not have if we didn't have these new use cases to like get us
Mm.
out of that rut.
Yeah, we'll see. because the media over QUIC group, it seems like you've got a lot of like CDN people and a lot of video, um, and I'll be so curious how it all comes out in the end if because I've seen like at the ITF that they've had like other working groups where these great problems to solve, but then it ends up like death by committee where it becomes too complicated for anyone to use. So like I hope that that QUIC doesn't go that like the video stuff doesn't end up becoming so complicated that people are, for better or worse, stuck on WebRTC. I Who
I
knows?
do think I think the core primitives of QUIC are really good, but weirdly they don't map that well to real time.
Mhm.
So there is a fair amount of work to do to build media over QUIC in a way that is actually really usable. I think it's possible. I like some of the work that that standards committee is doing, but it's a funny mapping. And my we all have a dog, a robot dog in the fight, and
Yeah.
my fear about QUIC is that it's the CDN people who will drive it because
Mhm.
their needs are totally legitimate, massive part of the web, very important, but very very different from real time. And if media over QUIC ends up being what YouTube needs, what Twitch thinks it needs, it's not maybe going to be what the new voice AI use cases need.
Yeah.
But hopefully people are super excited about the new conversational AI use cases, and that'll counterbalance that a little bit.
Yeah. And then and then it becomes like, will it be good enough for all the people that use WebRTC for security cameras, and will it be good enough for the people that are doing? Because it's like, it's just, it's hard to even like I lose track of all the different weird use cases that WebRTC is used for. Like being at like I think it was when I was at AWS, like how big of a business proctoring is with WebRTC. Like
Yeah.
and from the out like you would never expect that. You would be like, oh, it's all this, but all of a sudden you realize, oh my goodness, like all this you like all the amount of time that people are using it for like remote test taking, like that's like that might there might be I think there might be more remote test taking than conferencing because like with conferencing like you sit and talk to each other, but remote test taking like it's happening nonstop and you've got the proctors watching and all the students, and the students have to open multiple videos, one for their hands, one for the room. Like I don't know, like that's the thing, it's just it's hard to, no one really knows what people are using WebRTC for. So like I'm sure the most active person in the world, or like the most popular use case, we don't even realize because it's some business
Probably.
that we take for granted.
Funnily enough, the test proctoring use case was one of the first places in our customer base we saw people really, really trying to implement AI stuff.
Mhm.
And it's very different from the kind of generative AI conversational stuff now, but it was largely about how do you detect when somebody's trying to cheat on an exam, like computer vision algorithms, like voice matching algorithms, face detection, gaze tracking. So it was I would never have guessed that, but
Yeah,
it was a whole interesting thing. People were trying to build good, really accurate,
yeah.
really helpful, like remote test proctoring stuff.
And then like because the proctoring is such a cat and a mouse game because students are figuring out different ways to cheat, and then I would talk to these companies like I want to use AI, but if I pay a proctor to watch the video, it costs me this much an hour compared to how much it costs to run the AI, and like all the calculations they're running. It's a definitely a weird that has been an interesting one. And the other one I love is the bidding on cattle via WebRTC. Like I've
Yeah,
worked with
that's a
this
great.
company in Australia, yeah, and like it has to be super low latency, and people are like, I need like 7 milliseconds because I'm like bidding on cattle, and like if I lose to someone else because your video stream is too slow, I'm like, I never expected to work on this.
Yeah, yeah. That we had one of those too as a customer, and I was like, huh, I did not know cattle auctions were so high
Yeah,
stakes.
yeah. Dude, I feel like you just like I don't know how to wrap it back to be like that was a great pun, but cattle auctions are high stakes depending on what you're bidding on.
Right, exactly. Um, yes, I like puns. Uh,
Yeah,
oh, we should talk about SIP just a little bit because
yeah,
I mean, one of the things we are seeing is that, as a customer said to me the other day, vertical AI is real. Like answering the phone for medical practices. Like we have a quite a few customers doing that and scaling. Lots and lots of use cases I would never have expected where an LLM can talk to you on the phone and it's really really valuable for everyone involved. But we are seeing more growth now in telephony than in WebRTC as the transport. I suspect you're seeing that too, and you've done some SIP stuff. How does SIP fit into like the world of like it's almost like a blast from the past for you, right? It's like coming full
Yeah.
circle.
Yeah. So like I did the telephony stuff for 1-800 ChatGPT, and it's nice. It's all like just one code base, and it like since they both use the same underlying protocols, it was like, oh, just like move this into a common folder, and now you get both for free. Yeah, I'm so curious at where this is all going to land out, because it's funny that we still we're using these telephony, like we use SIP and stuff because we were um, trying to talk to old POTS lines and stuff like that. But now it's not. It's all digital anyway. So it's like we're like going back from like digital to back to analog to digital again. I think it's super exciting. I love it because it opens up all these AI experiences to people that aren't comfortable installing an app or using like these. And it's not even like a comfort thing. It's such high friction to expect someone to install an app and use it, um, especially when in many countries you're paying for like to download an app. To expect someone to be like, hey, you have to pay a couple dollars to download this multi-hundred megabyte app. It's so wonderful that they can just dial a phone number and have things work. Um,
I also
so
like the telephony interconnect. I have a to-do list uh, bot that calls
mhm,
me every day at a certain time on my phone and makes sure I'm doing what I'm supposed to, or like
mhm,
basically it says, well, what are your priorities today? What do you need to get done? And then I can ask it, did I get yesterday? Here's what I got done. Did that
mhm,
match what I told you yesterday? I try to build a lot of this stuff for myself because otherwise you don't figure it out. And I
yeah,
actually find that the telephone call is like a useful thing.
yeah,
And I could wire it up in a different way so that I got an SMS and then I clicked on a link, or I had a native mobile app that like plays a sound and alert. But there's something about the telephone call that's actually pretty compelling, even for that kind of silly use case. I love the POTS acronym, which stands for plain old telephone system.
yeah.
A classic, great acronym. The other acronym you will hear a lot if you're trying to figure out how to like wire up LLMs to telephones is PSTN, public switched telephone network.
Um, I can't. This has all been thinking about how. Tell me how you built this like outbound dialing thing. Did you use like parts of daily to like and like like
Yep.
how and you're like and it remembers what you said the day before.
Yeah, exactly. So the moving parts there's a Pipecat program
Hmm.
that runs on a cron job,
Hmm.
and it has access to a file system. Like it's really, really
Yeah,
simple.
no.
And LLM function calls are in the prompt so that when I say something that it knows it needs to save, or just before
Hmm.
disconnecting, it just dumps the transcript out to the file system.
Hmm.
And then when the cron job runs and the Pipecat bot starts, it loads like the last 30 days or something like that. It depends on the context length, and I'm always
Hmm.
playing with it. So you basically just pull a bunch of stuff into the context.
Yeah.
And then today's LLMs, like I've used GPT-4, I've used Claude for this, I'm now using Gemini Flash 2.0 beta for it. They're good enough at like a pretty big context that I can just have a free form conversation that's like, well, what did I not get done last week? Or I can't remember what I was supposed to do today. I did these three things. Did I miss anything? It's not perfect, but it's surprisingly good. And so there's just sort of a rolling
Yeah.
X number of days window that gets saved and then loaded back into the context. You could get a lot more sophisticated with it. Like you could do all kinds of sophisticated like summarization, which would be fun to play with, but kind of actually isn't necessary for
Mhm.
this personal app. And then the connectivity is we have a SIP, uh, SIP and WebRTC both at daily. So there's a REST API call that triggers a SIP outbound connection through one of our partners that has phone numbers. And so I have like a registered phone number on that system, and the SIP leg hits the API that bridges that to a ring on my phone number. So I can see the number that I have registered in the SIP system or in the PSTN system show up as the caller ID,
Mhm.
and I know that that's not a telemarketer calling.
Yeah.
That's my cron job calling.
Man, that. That is so magical to think that now you have like it remembers all this context, and it's not a it's an AI that's calling you and like remembers your day, and I think this stuff is so magical. Like I think the most magical part is like how easy it is to configure. Like I still am freaked out by the fact that when you write like a prompt, like when you're writing prompt in like a human language. Like I always imagined that I would be configuring an LLM by like writing code, being like, if this logic do that, but like it is so wild. Like I don't think I'll ever fully comprehend it. Like what a jump in like technology we had so quickly.
More and more parts. So the analogy for me that I've been thinking about is regular expressions,
Mhm.
where, you know, there was a time fairly early in my programming career where there was still often disagreement about whether to write some kind of hand coded expression to do text parsing or whether to just like write a big regular expression.
Mhm.
And reg-
I got some visitors.
oh, good. I
Yeah.
love it.
Oh no. Oh. And then he wanders away. Do you want to come say hi? Or are you all done? You want to come sit with me? You want to say hi, Quinn? This is Theo. This is my youngest.
Hey, Theo. How are you? It is the perfect way to wrap this up. Thank you so much. It's so fun to talk to you.
No, I had a blast.